Hey everyone, welcome back to the Business of Wellness. I'm your host, Jaclyn London, and wow, it has been a minute since we've had a new episode, right? So my major life update, I am officially a mom of 2 under 2. I have entered the 2 under 2 club. Our newest edition, Alice Golda, was born at the end of November. So I am mostly just trying to survive and balance life and work priorities all at the same time, which is a whole new chapter and challenge for me. So bear with me. More on that another time because we have some big topics to cover. I've got a lot of updates for you. So last week, I was in Washington, D.C. for National Ag Day as part of a small group invited to spend time at the USDA through an incredible team at America First Policy Institute. Because so much of my work sits at the intersection of nutrition science, agriculture, and communications, it was a very rare opportunity for me to see how these policy conversations are happening in real time, and not just in recommendations, but inside the systems that shape how they actually get implemented. So today's episode is going to be a little bit different from usual. I mean, we haven't been here in a while, right? First, I want to walk you through what National Ag Day was all about this year, what actually happened while I was there, and what stood out to me, especially around labeling transparency, which you guys know is hugely important to me, nutrition communication, obviously my wheelhouse, and the role of food producers in the MAHA movement and the broader public health discourse. Next, I am going to play a short interview I did with Calley Means. Calley is a former food industry lobbyist who later became a health policy advocate and is the co-founder of a company called TrueMed, which focused on expanding the use of health savings accounts and flexible saving accounts for products and services positioned as supporting metabolic health. Again, more on that later. He served as an advisor to RFK Jr. during his presidential run and most recently worked as special government employee at HHS. Now he is a White House senior advisor responsible for helping move the MAHA agenda forward across federal agencies and is widely considered one of the most influential figures in the MAHA movement. After the interview, I'll come back. I will share some additional context for you, some analysis, and I want to go through where I see important opportunities, open questions, areas that need further exploration and follow-up. But before we get into that, let me start with what National Ag Day was all about, because it was such an incredible day. I can't say that enough. The energy was amazing. The actual implementation of an event of like this at scale really shows you how important it is for the federal government to like be a well-oiled machine when it comes to implementing and putting on an event. And it made me think like, okay, yeah, like people could take a page out of this book. In many ways, it's like chaotic. There's so many things happening at once. And then in other ways, you're like, okay, you really have all of the details nailed down. So I want to get into all of that. A lot of the public conversation about food policy, especially right now in 2026, is focusing on what the dietary guidelines should say, how they impact consumer food choices outside of federal programs, what is happening within federal food programs, and how those are shaped by the dietary guidelines. But much less attention is getting paid to but much less attention is getting paid to how those recommendations actually show up in the environments where people are making decisions every day about food, especially how the overall philosophy of this edition of the Dietary Guidelines, Eat Real Food, translates into behavior change at the grocery store. Lack of transparency, and honestly, if we really want to get into it, lack of nutrition literacy, these are some of the biggest barriers to behavior change that we have right now at the consumer level specifically. And that's part of what made this so interesting to me. My whole career has been spent working with and for consumers. So I was really curious about how is this, what are you looking to see? How do you want things to work for everyday Americans outside of federal food programs? And I do feel like the topic of federal programs needs a little bit more of a deep dive from me, but that wasn't really the focus of my role on this day. So we'll circle back on that later. The big announcement of National Ag Day was an update to the Product of USA label for beef, pork, chicken, and eggs. Historically, that label didn't always mean what consumers thought it meant. Myself perfectly well included in that. Meat could carry a product of USA designation, even if animals were raised elsewhere and only processed domestically. So the updated guidance is intended to make that label align more closely with what consumer expectations are about origin. For me, this announcement is huge. I mean, it stood out not just as an agriculture policy update, but as a signal that clarity at the point of purchase for consumers is starting to be treated as part of public health infrastructure. If that is true, that is a really big deal. And I'm really hopeful that that's the direction we're going in. The announcement itself included remarks from RFK Jr., Secretary Brooke Rollins, Dr. Mehmet Oz, and Kelly Loeffler, which really underscored how agricultural policy is fitting within the broader health conversation right now. Conversations about labeling like this are ultimately conversations about food producers, because farmers and ranchers are the original small business owners in the American food system, and their work shapes what ends up in our food environment long before most policy conversations even take place. It's funny because I was thinking about this on the train home from DC. We talk so much culturally about founders of food brands and emerging CPG companies. And a lot of these folks get a lot of attention in the spotlight and the Shark Tank of it all, right? But we never really talk about the people producing the ingredients that those products depend on in the first place. Those are small business owners. Farmers and ranchers are small business owners. That perspective really hit me while I was there, and it really shaped how I thought about the rest of the day and how I've contextualized the day since then. My favorite part of National Ag Day, honestly, was the opportunity to connect directly with farmers and ranchers whose work shapes the food system long before nutrition guidance ever reaches us. We also started the morning with a smaller group breakfast conversation with Secretary Brooke Rollins of USDA, which gave us a chance to hear directly from policy leadership in a setting that felt unusually open, warm, and practical. Guys, when I tell you that regardless of your political affiliation, Secretary Rollins is one of one. She is incredibly dialed in on supporting American producers and advancing the interests of agriculture. She is also magnetic and magnanimous and extremely warm and interested in making connections between people in the room and with her. She really wants to hear what you have to say. The way that she spoke to everyone that was in this room at this breakfast was really so heartening, and it really reminded me that there are people that are in our midst in the political sphere that still believe in themselves as a public servant, right? And that is truly the vibe that you get from Secretary Rollins, that she could be the CEO of absolutely any company, but that she understands her role as a public servant. She's energetic. She's accessible. It was just so refreshing to see someone like Brooke Rollins be in DC in a position of power. Honestly, experiences like this breakfast make it clear how agriculture, nutrition, guidance, federal decision making, how all of this are actually connected. Because improving public health is not just about recommendations. It's about relationships between producers, policymakers, health professionals, and the people that those systems are meant to serve. That perspective really shaped how I was thinking about the policy conversations happening around the MAHA agenda while I was there, and the ways that those priorities sometimes align and sometimes diverge from the interests of American farmers and ranchers. So that's ultimately why I was thrilled to have the opportunity to speak with Calley Means, even if briefly. The interview took place live at the USDA press room during National Ag Day events, so there was a lot happening around us. You will hear that on the audio. Our time together was brief, but also an amazing 12 minutes. We were able to fit in 12 total minutes together, which I feel very grateful for, and I'm very grateful for Calley for taking the time. After the interview, I'm going to play that for you. After the interview, I will come back. I'll share some additional context and analysis. We'll get into where there's opportunities, questions worth exploring, and a deep dive on all of the content that Calley gave us and more. With that context, here is my conversation with White House Senior Advisor Calley Means. Calley, thank you so much for joining me. I am thrilled to be here at the USDA. What an honor. And I just want to say thank you for elevating the national conversation around food and nutrition and American health. I feel like for too long we have just been sidelining this conversation, and it's really been elevated to a point where we now have this in our zeitgeist, and it's something that we're speaking about frequently, and more people have greater awareness of it. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
My first question for you about the dietary guidelines, because this is my area of interest. I'm a registered dietitian. Given that 90% of Americans do not follow the dietary guidelines or have not historically followed the dietary guidelines, and 1 in 10 Americans are meeting produce recommendations, what do you see as the biggest lever that you can use to make changes to American health, to get people to start making changes where they're at home, outside of federal nutrition programs?
So we hear that talking point a lot, that people don't follow the dietary guidelines. I question that a little bit. Growing up in the 90s, my parents thought they were doing the right thing by giving us the refined carbohydrates, by doing the low-fat diet. The dietary guidelines in the 90s with the food pyramid dramatically changed the American diet. Our actually percentage of our total diet in fat, healthy fats, went down 20%. Carbohydrate consumption actually went up 20% in the 10 years from the original food pyramid. So I actually think in America, we listen and respect authority. We take our vaccines for the most part when they're recommended. We shut down the country when the doctors said to shut down the country. So I think our theory with this is that the dietary guidelines made some strong points. Now we can quibble, and I think we encourage this academic discussion around the optimal amount of protein, around the optimal amount of various macros. But the core point of this document is, for the first time, it said, we really got to avoid highly processed food. We really got to avoid highly refined carbohydrates. And we really need to look at our added sugar intake, which has increased dramatically. So those core points and strong public health messaging, getting those things right, and the eat real food, the government's never said, put a stake in the ground for real food. It hasn't happened before in the dietary guidelines. So we're hoping that this strong message, and again, with debate around the margins, but a message that's supported by the American Heart Association, the American Medical Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics said nice things about the macro messages. We're really trying to get wide agreement on those core messages and hope that strong message will have a big public health impact. But for Americans, I think it's clear. I think the message, the macro message, is clear, to really look at your plate, to be striving, and we know it's hard. And that's why we're working to improve school lunches, working to improve military meals, working to improve SNAP. But I think Americans are ready to hear that message. Eat real food, really think about the processing of your food, really think about the refined carbohydrates, think about the added sugar, and you actually see totally unexpected and pretty dramatic shifts in the American diet over the past 2 years already. Snacks are going down, sugary drink sales are going down. So I think it's starting to happen.
One thing that I have often thought about the MAHA movement, and something that we hear frequently within the administration, is that we talk a lot about ingredients and specific food additives, things that we would like to eliminate from the food supply. But we don't talk enough, in my opinion, about food marketing and how it can be predatory and targeting parents and kids especially. Where do you see this fitting into the MAHA agenda, and how do you have plans to actualize, again, some of the food marketing that confuses Americans even more about how to eat and how to feed their families?
So I don't know, I recently learned this, so I'm not sure if you know this. So we've been speaking a lot to the Federal Trade Commission, and there is one thing in law that the Federal Trade Commission cannot regulate, and that is marketing of food to children. So actually, several decades ago, I believe it was in the 70s, there was significant public concern about the rise of ultra-processed food and marketing to children. And the Federal Trade Commission actually started really weighing in on that. And Congress said, you can't do that, put in a bill, they cannot regulate that. So actually, the federal government, the only thing that they actually really can't weigh in on is marketing kits, which is actually, we're working very closely. This is in the MAHA Commission strategy to look into food marketing. The federal government's hands specifically are tied on that issue. So that's something we're going to be talking a little bit about more. But yes, we're going to, it's funny you mentioned that, we're going to be talking about this. And I think one thing that's been very positive in the past year with this administration is we've been using convening power. We've been calling major companies. We're meeting with them every single day. And we do call on food companies to really be thinking carefully about how they're marketing to children. And we're looking at all possible levers we can pull on that, because we do think it's a problem. I mean, your child in this country, they go on their entertainment and their YouTube, they're getting bombarded with ultra-processed food ads. I really think there's a problem with government incentives, with school lunches, with SNAP. We're getting these kids addicted to high sugar items, to refined carbohydrates. And there's a lot of research at a young age. Your palate develops, your microbiome develops. So we're very concerned about food marketing. We've called that out, and we hope we'll have more action on that. But again, the federal government, it's astounding. The FTC, by law, cannot weigh in strongly on children's marketing.
It's really wild. If you had to take, let's say, 3 of the top priorities of the dietary guidelines for American food producers, what are some of the signals there that you think producers should be paying attention to, and what should food companies take away from where the dietary guidelines are right now?
Yeah, for producers, we're trying to add momentum to something that's already happening in the market and something that's already happening in culture, which is a real, I think, more of an examination and scrutiny of the food label. So we are trying to put weight. The message to food producers is they're good people, great companies, American companies. They've played by the rules up to this point, but they will admit behind closed doors, we've lost our way a little bit. We have lost our way with the amount of additives and level of processing of our food. So we are certainly pushing with the dietary guidelines on the market, something that's already happening, which is we need to get more and more to minimally processed food. I mean, it's incremental, but I like that these large companies are taking incrementally additives out of the food. People say food dyes. Well, that's not that's playing small ball. I think if we have these incremental changes over the next 10 years and a revolution in this country more to whole food, it's going to dramatically impact farms. It's going to dramatically impact the American plate. So that's one message to the food producers. The second message is, this is a free country. We're not doing massive nanny state policies, but ultra-processed food companies are not entitled to government money, particularly when it comes to school lunches, military food. I have to tell you, and this is just the reality, the USDA spends almost $500 million a day on food procurement, and ultra-processed food companies have seen that as a piggy bank. You have had massive food companies on public earnings calls saying that the biggest growth area for their business over the past decade has been government money for school lunches and things like that. And again, we are pro-free market. We are not nanny state, but junk food companies and soda companies do not have a right to government money, particularly when that money is procuring food for our kids. That money is going to go more towards farmers. So a strong message to the food industry is we are going to be relentless about scrutinizing where government money is going, and you should not be depending on your future growth for government money.
Love that. Yeah. Totally agree. All right, my last very quick question for you. Dietitians like myself are leading experts in nutrition. We feel left out from the administration. We would love to help. We would love to be your partners in helping to bring these really excellent recommendations, the Eat Real Food message to the American public. Are you up for working with some RDs and bringing us into the fold?
Well, I think we are communicating with RDs and talking to them in many ways. I'll just be blunt on a couple items. We know that there are millions of registered dietitians that are doing incredible work around the country. I actually think when you look at HHS, we're doing whatever we possibly can to empower them with reimbursement and other money. There's actually a lot happening on that. I do have a problem with the dietitian group, who I met with many times, who did not celebrate the messages of the dietary guidelines about reducing ultra-processed food, about reducing sugar, about reducing highly refined carbohydrates, actually issued a press release attacking it when they vocally celebrated the previous dietary guidelines, which did not call out ultra-processed food when we have a metabolic health crisis, did not call out added sugar. Was very, very weak, and I think unacceptable. I don't get why they've done that. I have a suspicion that they do take a lot of money. I don't understand why the core dietitian credentialing organ, maybe you have an idea, or maybe this makes sense, I don't know. They take significant money from ultra-processed food companies. I don't understand how that makes sense. HHS might look into that. But that we do have an issue with the credentialing organization. And we
Totally
met with them in good
understand.
faith.
Yeah.
We met with them in good faith, and they put politics. How a dietitian organization could not have said those large macro points or could not agree, I don't get it. And when a group can't put their political ideology behind, they can't put that behind what's best for American children and agree with those core messages with absolutely quibbling and discussion underneath that. Again, we are encouraging debate about macros. That's one point. The second point, and I've seen some of your posts about talking about education in medical school and things like that. We do think it's a problem that the entire, I think dietitians need to be more front and center of the medical debate. I think a lot of doctors see dietitians as kind of a fringe thing. We are trying to bring that thinking into the mainstream. We are trying to bring thinking about nutrition and the complexity of the body and how it's all connected to chronic disease. We are trying to propel that and propel dietitians into the mainstream. We're trying to merge that as much as possible. The medical system sees things as too siloed right now. Obviously, you need to look at things in silos if you're dealing with acute illnesses, if you're going to do surgery on somebody. But for chronic disease, it's very interconnected. So we would love to see dietitians elevated.
Great. Really appreciate that. And certainly we agree with you about the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics 100%. So I would just say that we separate the practitioner from the governing body, which you do. And I appreciate that.
I hope this moment is, and I know it's very complex and it's politics, but I hope dietitians are feeling some momentum that people are talking more about this, and we absolutely want to propel that practice, and I hope it is.
I love that. And conversations like this are so important. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Okay, there was a lot in that conversation, and I want to walk through a few places where I agreed, places where more context might help, where there's real opportunity to move forward, and where I do think there are some questions that really need to be addressed. Let me start with the first question that I asked about how the dietary guidelines for Americans are implemented outside of federal nutrition programs. Just before we get into Calley's response, to set the stage, the dietary guidelines directly shape things like school meals, WIC, SNAP-Ed, what remains of SNAP-Ed, and other large-scale nutrition infrastructure that affects millions of people. Outside of those programs, their influence on individual consumer behavior is much more nuanced and indirect. You heard me mention in this interview that roughly 90% of Americans don't follow the dietary guidelines, and Calley pushed back on that statistic based on his own personal experience growing up in the 90s. And we're almost the same age. So I want to acknowledge why it can feel like people are following the guidelines and why it can feel like the guidelines are influencing everything, and certainly that they were influencing everything, because they do influence consumers. It's just not usually in that direct way. Where they matter most for consumers is upstream, through how they shape the food environment that they're navigating every day. And that's also where a lot of the conversation about corporate influence on the dietary guidelines actually comes from. There is some truth behind that concern about corporate influence on the dietary guidelines, but it's important to be precise about where and when that influence actually shows up. It's not happening through the underlying nutrition science, even though that's been talked about widely. And I do believe I've heard Calley Means say that before, though he did not mention that in this interview. It's not happening through the underlying nutrition science or through the scientists who are responsible for making recommendations. And it's not happening through direct messaging to consumers. Where it shows up most clearly is in how recommendations get translated into policy language in a very specific time period. It's the time between the release of the Scientific Advisory Committee's report and the publication of the final dietary guidelines document. That's about a 1-year time span usually. And it's about how that language ultimately shapes what shows up at the grocery store. One way I often explain this is something that you start to notice when you look across multiple editions of the guidelines over time. When the dietary guidelines tell Americans what to eat, they name foods, vegetables, fruit, whole grains. When they tell Americans what to limit, they tend to name nutrients. That's why historically you see language encouraging things like fruits, veggies, whole grains, dairy, right? But instead of naming specific foods to cut back on, the foods to limit, the guidance says things like limit added sugar, limit sodium, limit saturated fat. All of these things are true, but they are relying on a baseline nutrition knowledge among consumers. That's the generous interpretation. Or you might know that consumers have a very limited understanding of what sources of added sugar, saturated fat, and sodium actually are. And therefore, you might be subtly signaling something that just winds up being completely meaningless in practice. So it makes people feel like, okay, if I were to follow this document exactly, I would know what to eat. But when it comes to what to limit, oh, I guess I'm limiting sugar, so I guess I'm limiting dessert, right? That's the thought process I would imagine among many consumers today. That distinction might sound really subtle. It has real implications for how the food environment evolves, because if the guidelines consistently named major food sources of overconsumed nutrients, for example, the number one source of added sugar in the American diet is sugary beverages, you can see how differently that would land for both consumers and industry. And you can also see how a company like the Coca-Cola Company has a very real interest in guidance that focuses on naming nutrients rather than naming beverage categories directly. You see how different that would be? Like if earlier versions of the dietary guidelines had consistently said, limit sugar-sweetened beverages instead of limit added sugar, there's a reasonable argument that companies across the beverage sector might have been pushed to reformulate and expand lower and no sugar options earlier, and that sugar-sweetened beverages might not still be the biggest source of added sugar in the American diet today. It's this. This is what I think Calley and other MAHA influencers are picking up on when they say that corporate interests influence nutrition guidance. It's not that companies are shaping the science itself. It's that policy language shapes how recommendations interact with the marketplace, and companies respond accordingly. That's because what gets published as the dietary guidelines is often doing two things at once. It is reflecting the best available scientific evidence, like what's being taken from the recommendations that were initially provided, and the translating that evidence into policy language that's shaped during the public comment process by stakeholder input, including from those companies whose products are directly affected by how those recommendations are written. I could go on and on with examples of this and industries that have lobbied for specific recommendations for specific language in the dietary guidelines. But I feel like the sugar sweetened beverages one is a powerful one because sugar sweetened beverages are the number one source of added sugar in the American diet. It really shows you how powerful that has been to not actually name those beverages in previous editions of the dietary guidelines. You know, the other thing I was thinking about on this topic is that it's also where the phrase everything in moderation starts to function differently depending on who's using it, right? As a dietitian on an individual level, moderation is at the core of everything I do, right? It's a completely reasonable and practical way of thinking about eating. And it's truly the way every culture around the world considers, best health practices, right? But when moderation messaging comes from food companies that produce foods with overconsumed nutrients, it can operate less like empowerment and more like positioning. And that distinction matters when we're talking about population level health. It almost feels like weaponization, right? So when it feels like to Calley that people were following the dietary guidelines directly, what they were often responding to instead is a version of those recommendations that had already been filtered through the food environment around them. They were a product of the foods that were available at the supermarket, the marketing at the time, all about low fat, all about making things low fat at all costs and using refined carbohydrates and added sugar to do so, right? So to that end, I really want to say that the way that the 2025 to 2030 dietary guidelines, this edition of the dietary guidelines, are written does represent a meaningful shift in this direction, because I think there are some really powerful signals to industry. They're much clearer about which foods contribute the most to overconsumed nutrients. They move away from a hugely important statement of the past, which is make half your grains whole, which if you just flip that statement is make half your grains refined, right? So I'm glad that we have stepped away from that. That framing, I think, was doing a lot of work for the food industry. And it gave them permission to keep their other highly refined products more in play, right? And again, coming back to that point of everything in moderation, you can make as many products as you want and then tell individuals everything in moderation, right? The goal is that this kind of more direct language helps to push innovation in the food system toward products that better reflect these new recommendations, these new guidelines. And that is, to me, one of the biggest strengths of this edition of the Dietary Guidelines. And it's something that people working in prevention-focused nutrition policy, including voices in the MAHA conversation, could be highlighting even more. The specific way that the language can shape the food industry. That focus is really important. It has been there since the Dietary Guidelines were first created. So I don't know that everyday Americans were following by the letter the Dietary Guidelines, but I do know that the Dietary Guidelines shape our food environment, and marketing can function in a variety of different ways based on what's in those dietary guidelines, and product formulation can function differently. So it's really worth thinking about the dietary guidelines as an industry tool and how it shapes our food environment rather than an individual tool. All right. So my next question for Calley was about food marketing, especially about marketing to kids, because this is one area where there's a lot of confusion about what the federal government can and can't do. In the interview, you heard Calley mention that the Federal Trade Commission can't regulate marketing of food to kids. And it is true that the FTC's authority here has been limited since the 1970s when Congress stepped in after the agency explored restrictions on child-directed advertising. However, it's not accurate to say that the federal government can't weigh in on food marketing to children at all, right? Agencies like the FTC and the FDA still have authority over deceptive advertising, labeling claims, how products are presented to consumers, and Congress absolutely has the power to expand those authorities if it chooses to. So the policy question isn't whether anything can be done. It's what kinds of interventions would actually move the needle. And that's where I think the conversation about food marketing sometimes focuses a little bit too narrowly on additives, individual ingredients, instead of the broader information environment that parents are navigating every day. Because food marketing today doesn't just look like cartoon characters on cereal boxes. And this is part of what we're up against. Like, this is part of the bigger, larger problem about nutrition literacy and about our, somewhat unmitigated marketing environment. Food marketing also looks like Mr. Beast on YouTube. And Calley alluded to that as well in the interview, but it also looks like something else. And this is where MAHA eludes me, okay? Because it also looks like packages of food products covered in claims like non-GMO project verified and gluten-free, and my favorite one, no artificial ingredients, animal-based, no MSG, no artificial colors, plant-based, labels that do not necessarily tell you anything meaningful or for that matter, legitimate. I mean, I could go on and on about this, but there are things that don't tell you anything meaningful about the overall nutritional quality of a food, but position the product in a way that makes those products sound healthier or safer than they actually are. I'll just give you an example in my everyday life, which is just anyone who is a mom of a kid in preschool and beyond will relate to this. Annie's cheddar bunnies. Okay, you guys know the Annie's cheddar. The positioning of these veritable goldfish, okay, these are just goldfish. Annie's took it upon themselves to seek USDA organic certification. The only difference between Annie's and regular goldfish is the farming system that was used to produce the grains, the enriched grains, the white refined grains that went into those products. There's nothing else that's different about them. Annie's isn't using 100% whole grains versus goldfish using refined grains. That's not what's happening. What's happening is that it's basically the same product with a different marketing lens and different product packaging and positioning to consumers who are seeking organic options. And if you are a mom and you've got regular goldfish, let me tell you, you're getting looks. Because people don't understand that, like, there's actually no difference between what you're getting in one package versus the other. Both farming systems are safe. Both have advantages and disadvantages for producers. So right there's just this massive chasm of misinformation that takes place when when the product positioning and the marketing of a product doesn't actually align with what consumers think it means. Parents, by the way, we're all just trying to make the best choices for our kids. And that's why kids often become targets of food marketing in 2026 through their parents. It's us we're trying to make the best possible choices, but we're being asked to interpret signals that do not have any meaning when it comes to nutritional quality. It's actually one place where I think the MAHA movement has obviously very clearly resonated with people, because this has been a lot of the conversation is about additives and ingredients in our food, ingredients in ultra-processed food. It's tapped into a real concern. And I do think that that concern is shedding light on something bigger, which is that labels should mean something about health when you're using them to make decisions at the grocery store. And it comes back to product of the USA label. If you believe a product to mean something, if you believe a label to mean something on a product, it should reflect the generally recognized belief. But here's the thing about MAHA and all of this. At the same time, many of the loudest voices in the MAHA space, like take for example, the Food Babe. She's also promoting products that are positioned as better for you. She's got protein powder, Truvani, like their bars, protein powders, simply because they're made without ingredients described as artificial or non-GMO or USDA organic. Even though what counts as artificial, for example, is itself a regulatory definition, not a marker of nutritional value. That kind of thing, that creates a situation where products can be priced and marketed as healthier without meaningfully improving dietary patterns. Priced higher, rather, and marketed as healthier without improving dietary patterns. And more than anything, it highlights how large the nutrition literacy gap still is in this country and how difficult it is for families to distinguish between marketing signals and meaningful nutrition guidance. I say that as both a mom of two and an RD with a background in food marketing. Without my training, I genuinely would find this food environment confusing too. And I feel like I am overeducated, okay? And it is too confusing at the grocery store for everyday people. You can take what's essentially candy, swap beetroot for Red 40, and suddenly the product can be marketed as a better for you snack, even though beetroot itself isn't present in meaningful amounts that would actually deliver antioxidants. And the red dye that it replaced wasn't a meaningful health risk to begin with because there's not actually enough in there. So when we talk about protecting kids from food marketing, we also have to talk about protecting parents from confusing nutrition signals. And a lot of that, I think, starts with clarifying third-party labeling on food products and marketing claims on food products. Right now, a lot of marketing is operating through fear-based labeling rather than through information that actually helps make healthier decisions at point of sale. And that's an area where federal policy, especially around labeling standards and marketing claims, could make a real difference. If the goal is prevention, then helping parents quickly identify what foods contribute to healthier dietary patterns would move the needle much more than focusing narrowly on the fear-based messaging about single additives in isolation. I promise those additives in isolation of everything else that you do on an individual level and a systems level are not the problem. It's the totality of the foods that you consume and the dietary patterns and the food environments that make it so easy for you to eat all of these foods that are ultra-processed and less nutritious, and make it much harder to eat whole foods, nutrient-dense foods that are linked to better health outcomes across the lifespan. My last bottom line on this, what shapes kids' eating habits is not a single ingredient, and it's also not a single touch point with a food product. It is the environment in which they grow up and the extent that we can provide them with the most nutritious options that are often going to include sometimes foods that have to sit on a shelf, but we just want the transparency factor to be there. We want to know that what we're buying accurately reflects what we think we're buying. The next question I asked Calley is, what signals American food producers and food companies should be taking from the new dietary guidelines right now? And the response focused mostly on reducing ultra-processed foods and shifting federal procurement away from companies that rely heavily on federal and government purchasing, especially in school meals and military food systems. That's an important conversation, and I agree that where federal food dollars go matters a lot. School meals, military procurement, other institutional programs shape food environment at scale, and they should absolutely be aligned with prevention-focused nutrition policy. But I also think that there are clearer signals in the dietary guidelines themselves that producers should be paying attention to right now. So I want to go through a couple of what I see as those big opportunities, because I think that's important for us to review where this could be truly beneficial for American farmers and ranchers right now. One of the biggest shifts in this edition of the Dietary Guidelines is that the recommendations are more direct about which foods Americans need more of, and not just which nutrients to limit. Yes, I can already hear the comments saying, we've always done that. We've always done that. Yes, we have always done that, but I do think it was explicit and well written in many ways about when the document is actually telling us what to eat. Fruits, veggies, dairy, seafood, beans, nuts, seeds, whole grains, and of course, meat. Foods that help to close some of the most persistent nutrient gaps in the American diet. That kind of specificity really matters, because when guidance names the foods, it creates clearer incentives from across the supply chain, from farmers to manufacturers to retailers, about where innovation and investment are most likely to align with long-term public health priorities. Now, I say that with also the caveat that long-term is a tricky statement when it comes to American politics, right? Because there's always a new administration every 4 years, or every 8 years, and then there's always a new set of dietary guidelines every 5 years. So it does do a lot to shape, but people tend to move quickly on this, because you do know that there will be a next edition coming at a certain point, and there's always certain considerations that you have to think about of what you can reasonably execute within that 5-year window. In this DGA, there's also a stronger emphasis on protein-rich foods across the lifespan, which is another huge, meaningful signal for producers, especially ranchers, those working in dairy, seafood, beef, pulses, other nutrient-dense protein categories that support muscle health and metabolic health and healthy aging. The recommendation to eat fruits and veggies throughout the day is another example of guidance that has real implications for the marketplace. I really like how that was written in this edition of the guidelines. Eat fruits and veggies throughout the day. I think that's a very clear signal to industry. That kind of language encourages innovation and packaging, preparation, convenience. It's how can we make produce easier to eat on the go, easier to keep at home and actually use, easier to incorporate into meals and snacks across the day? How can we make it tastier so that you're getting the best possible version of an apple when you go to buy apples at your grocery store? I just think it's important to remember that where you are when you make decisions about food really matters. And I like that subtle signal there in the eat veggies and fruit throughout the day. Really an important signal right there. The guidelines also meaningfully tighten recommendations around added sugars, including clearer direction to stay closer to the evidence, which is about 5 to 7% of calories coming from added sugar, and practical guidance. This was the practical guidance for industry, like limiting added sugar to roughly 10 grams or less per meal. Huge. This is not something that you will find in literature. Limit meals to 10 grams max per meal. But it is language that was used in the dietary guidelines, and I think it's a perfect example of how these guidelines are meant for industry and not for everyday consumers. From a product marketing and innovation standpoint, that's also a really clear signal that it's time to think about ways to cut down on added sugar in a lot of the products we see at the supermarket. It gives product developers concrete benchmarks to work towards, and I think more concrete benchmarks to work towards is a good idea. There's also a clearer acknowledgement in this edition that there's a place for a range of dairy options. I like this one a lot too, including whole milk dairy as well as low fat and fat free choices, which helps reflect both consumer preference and the role that dairy foods play across the nutrition landscape in closing nutrient gaps while supporting American dairy farmers. So when we talk about what we should take away from this edition of the guidelines, the message isn't just reduce processing or stop eating processed foods. It's that prevention-focused nutrition policy is increasingly pointing toward whole and minimally processed foods, great, that help close nutrient gaps, and toward clearer alignment between what gets produced, what gets marketed, and what actually supports a healthier dietary pattern over time. What we are missing from this is how. How are we going to do this? How are we going to make sure that this is actually implemented? Because ultimately, the most useful signal that the dietary guidelines sends to producers isn't just what to remove. It's about paying attention to what the country needs more of. And we see that happening across the innovation space in CPG food, but we rarely get to talk about it from the standpoint of how it affects our American farmers and ranchers, how it affects the people that produce food in this country. I think closing that gap is something that's really meaningful and really important. Now, my next question will be how? How are we going to do this? And I'd love to hear more from Calley on that at some point. The next exchange we need to come back to was my third question for Calley about dietitians and whether or not there's an opportunity to work more closely with RDs and HHS and the administration working on the MAHA agenda. I honestly appreciated hearing that there's interest in bringing more dietitians into the mainstream conversation around chronic disease prevention, because that is something that many of us in the profession have been working toward for a long time. But I also want to clarify one point that came up in his response, which was the idea that the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics didn't acknowledge anything positive in the new dietary guidelines. It's not quite what happened. The Academy's official statement, you can look this up online, it's widely available, actually supported several major elements of the guidelines, including encouraging fruits, veggies, whole grains, limiting added sugars and highly processed foods, and maintaining the recommendation to keep saturated fat below 10% of total calories. At the same time, they raised concerns about other areas around how some of the guidance on full fat dairy and red meat fits with longstanding cardiovascular recommendations, for example. And honestly, the thing that I'm not sure is clear to Calley, and it doesn't seem to be, because he mentioned the Academy praising previous editions of the guidelines, and perhaps he's right about that, and I'll get to that in a sec. That kind of response is generally pretty typical from the Academy. Debating the strengths and limitations and limitations of the dietary guidelines every 5 years is like a tradition within the dietetics profession. We love it. We look forward to red meat to us, right? Like, we love going back and forth on this, where we agree, where we disagree. I actually had an Instagram live with my colleague, Carrie Glassman, where we basically broke down every element of the dietary guidelines and debated the parts we liked, the parts we didn't. And we disagreed in certain places. And I love that, because two professionals with the same background and experience, or different backgrounds and experience, but the same training and education, having a meaningful dialogue about this really shows you where there's pros and cons, and how there's always room for interpretation and nuance and different opinions on even just on interpretation of the research, right? So I get it. I really understand his sentiment, and I really do understand how, if that is what stands out among other organizations like American Heart Association and American Diabetes Association and American Academy of Pediatrics, like, if all of these organizations are making stronger positive statements about the DGA, it does seem a little weird that the Academy wouldn't do that. But to be honest, it's not that surprising. It's not that surprising coming from the Academy. In general, nutrition is a science and a practice discipline, and people working in different areas, clinical care, public health, agriculture, industry, research, we're all going to interpret different parts of the guidelines differently. But the thing that I said to Calley at the very end, that I said it quickly, so I hope he caught it, I hope you guys caught it. It's also just so important to separate the Academy as an organization from dietitians as practitioners. I disagree with the Academy about 95, maybe 99% of the time. But one of the structural realities for people outside of the profession, so something that people might not realize, is that nutrition simply is not a high profit sector compared to other areas of healthcare or food policy. It's just not. We get blamed for a lot of shit, and yet we're not a high profit interest. So we're rarely seen as people that can help other people make more money, right? So because of that, the Academy, just a little context here, because this should blow your mind. The Academy spent in 2024 $80,000 on lobbying. In policy terms, that is literal pocket money. I mean, that's like if I translated this into real life, it's like the equivalent of like a nickel that my daughter took to school to put in a little piggy bank jar, right? So when we talk about influence in nutrition policy conversations, it's important to keep that scale in perspective. Dietitians do not have lobbying dollars. You know who does? Chiropractors. Yeah. Chiropractors have a lot more money than dietitians do to lobby for their interests in Washington. that's a topic for another time, but just wanted to drop that here. At the same time, I do understand why there's been tensions between parts of the MAHA movement and the Academy in recent years. The organization has faced criticism from within the profession, from us, over past corporate partnerships. And it's also been responding to public messaging that many dietitians felt mischaracterized their role in evidence-based nutrition. I'm not even going to mention the horrific hit job of the Washington Post that I am going to mention it, but it just, most of you will know what I'm talking about here. And those of you who don't, you can look it up and then look at the numbers and see how pathetic it is that the Washington Post would even choose to write stories like this about a healthcare profession that has done nothing but try to improve the lives, the health of everyday Americans. Okay. That's more on that later. To be candid, the Academy as an organization does not always represent dietitians strongly or as strategically as this profession really deserves. And that's a long-standing concern within the field. But I just want to make sure that we're not confusing the reach of the Academy with the reach of dietitians themselves. None of these issues or concerns change the bigger opportunity here. If the goal is to move nutrition into the center of chronic disease prevention policy, then dietitians are the most underutilized profession in the healthcare workforce right now. The most underutilized profession. And I agree with Calley on that point, and I'm glad he said it. Again, I return to the question of how. How are you going to bring us into the fold? It seems like he might have alluded to a reimbursement conversation and for getting more preventative nutrition care covered by insurance, but we didn't get specifics on that, so we're going to need more. There is an enormous potential for dietitians to play a larger role, not just in treatment, but in prevention, education, implementation of the kinds of food environment changes that the guidelines are trying to support. And again, what remains now is how. How are we going to advance the work of dietitians as key players in preventative health? So I do hope that there's more of an opening, that there's an opening for more of us to get involved and to weigh in from a boots on the ground perspective. Happy to come back to Washington to have those conversations absolutely anytime and to talk to people about what our profession could actually meaningfully do to help both bridge this gap between food producers and healthcare professionals, and also how we can start having conversations that meaningfully are focused on action at the preventative level, not at the treatment level. One last moment, unrelated to the interview with Calley Means, from National Ag Day that stayed with me was Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s speech, his intro remarks at National Ag Day before or perhaps after the Product of the USA label was announced, in which his opening remarks about the new label included his usual talking points about the Dietary Guidelines scientific report. I inherited an illegible document. It was totally unreadable. I couldn't use it at all. No one would be able to understand this, right? You guys have heard that before. He says it on a lot of podcasts as well. He was just on the Bostics, the new Skinny Confidential podcast, and that clip is all over my algorithm. It was shaped by the mercantile interests of the food industry. Okay. All right. So I feel the need to respond to this here because a lot of claims get pushed around and elevated every time I hear RFK make a speech to this effect. And I feel like it's really important to just have a place where we clarify a couple of things, because I think it's really important for how we move forward as a country and how we start to rebuild or build maybe faith in public health institutions. And by the way, the other talking point that comes up constantly when RFK Jr. speaks, and specifically in this setting, was the same group that put the Fruit Loops at the top of the food pyramid. Respectfully, I say this as someone who is trying to be helpful because I think the core message and the core mission is so important, and I want to be collaborative and work together. But when you say that Fruit Loops are the top of the food pyramid, do we know that the top of the food pyramid is the smallest part of the pyramid? Like, if this were actually true, which it is not, but if it were actually true, if Fruit Loops were at the top, that would be a good thing. So I think someone maybe needs to get this over to Bobby and say, listen, like, if you want to make this claim, I think you're going to have to say Fruit Loops are at the bottom of the food pyramid. Okay. Because the bottom is the base of a food pyramid. Maybe he's just confused because now we flipped the food pyramid. So it's upside down. I don't know. But if you wanted to make this argument, Bobby, the case would be the Fruit Loops are at the bottom. Okay. All right. I digress. A lot of this is inaccurate, and anyone can see that, right? Like you can easily find this out on the internet. That the scientific report itself is public and it's available online. However, there's a very legitimate policy conversation to be had about how that report was framed. It is very legitimate, okay? And I just want to walk you through where I see this coming up. And I say this from a completely nonpartisan perspective, but as someone on the outside looking in and noticing that there are certain things that should have perhaps been talked about if the goal is to align with the people who believe in you politically, okay? The concept of health equity, that phrase, health equity, appeared dozens of times throughout the scientific report. Okay, so that initial report that RFK is talking about when he makes statements like this, that is the scientific report from the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee that comes out the year before the DGA is published. And this is what he's saying he threw away when he got into office. In that report, there is some very high quality nutrition science. There's important nutrition science and discussion of the evolution of nutrition science in the past 5 years, as there always have and always should be and will be. There is also more than 150 mentions of this phrase, health equity. That is a meaningful signal about how this committee approached its work. And it's also a term that different administrations and different policymakers interpret differently, right? Health equity is a term that we do not often hear used very much on the right. Equity in general is a word that is not typically associated with the right, especially the Trump administration, and it is associated with the left. So it's completely reasonable for Secretary Kennedy to say, and for all of us to debate whether that framing belongs in the dietary guidelines, or how and if it should influence federal nutrition policy going forward. That is a policy discussion. Raising that as part of the public conversation is very different from saying that the nutrition science itself was compromised. Those aren't the same claim. And when the conversation shifts toward suggesting the science or the scientists are the problem, it risks undermining trust in the very infrastructure that we rely on to improve public health in the first place. So from a political standpoint, there was actually an opportunity here to make a strong argument that would resonate with many supporters of the administration about how federal nutrition guidance should be implemented, how programs should be aligned with prevention, and how language like health equity is being used as a policy framework within federal nutrition guidance. Instead, framing the report as captured by industry shifts the conversation away from implementation. It shifted away from implementation and toward mistrust of the research process itself. This is unhelpful at best. It makes it harder to build durable support for prevention-focused nutrition policy over time. And it will have a lasting effect. I do believe that we're currently at a moment where we are seeing a lot of overcorrections to some of the past mistakes that have been made at the federal level, specifically during COVID. We're seeing a pendulum swing go in the completely opposite direction. And I just want to always make sure that on this podcast, on my platforms, we are focusing on the science itself. What does the nutrition science say? Get the politics out of the science, and then you guys can discuss on your own what you want the politics to look like. But for us, for practitioners like me, it's important to be clear about what science says and what it doesn't say. And frankly, I actually don't hear enough people in my position saying this about that scientific report, because I think a lot of people have overlooked the fact that maybe that framing of health equity isn't something that both political sides, both political parties align on necessarily. But the science itself, the data itself, the protein recommendation, right? Like all of those things are solid. So we don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but we do need to consider what parts of it we're going to publicly discuss, what parts of it are policy, and what parts of it are actual science. So I want to close with something practical, because if the goal really is to make America healthier, and I believe that's a goal across the political spectrum, I think it's a very bipartisan goal, there are policy levers that would move the needle. So I want to talk about 5 areas, and I've talked about these on this podcast before. I did a full deep dive into each area, so you can go back to a previous episode, and I will link that in our show notes today. But there are 5 areas where we already have evidence, momentum, and bipartisan opportunity to make America healthy again. And I want to just share my thoughts with you on this. Again, I am a dietitian. I am not a politician, but these are some things that just as an outside observer of the whole nutrition landscape and the political landscape, there are a couple things that stand out as things that we could be talking about more that we're not. Okay. So the first is to bring cooking classes back to schools, or bring cooking classes to schools in the first place. Because typically when I hear people talk about this topic, I hear reference to trad wifing and to home ec. And I think all of those can be one thing, but also in the real world where we want kids to be building more skills, all kids to be learning more STEM-based skills. Cooking is STEM. Cooking is science, technology, engineering, and math. Cooking is a scientific process. Learning it in school can be positioned as part of STEM curriculums, and thinking about how we can allocate federal funding to states for these programs would be hugely impactful. One of the biggest gaps in nutrition is not knowledge. It's skills. And kids are growing up without learning how to prepare food or how to recognize ingredients or how meals actually come together. And that has really long-term consequences for confidence, for independence, and for health. Adding on hands-on cooking education into STEM and health curricula is one of the most durable prevention strategies we have, because it focuses on kids. And also, if anyone who has kids is listening to this, you already know this. If they make it, they eat it. When kids make the food, they eat it. Food confidence is a long-term lever for behavior change over time. All right. Second, reform the Farm Bill to support fruits and vegetables. Right now, billions of dollars in subsidies support commodity crops like corn and soy, while foods Americans are consistently told to eat more of, like veggies and fruit, receive far less structural support. This is not to say that all federal programs are good or all federal programs are bad, but programs like GusNIP are already showing what happens when we make produce more affordable and accessible, right? So expanding those kinds of incentives would support farmers and improve dietary patterns at the same time. That is prevention policy, my friends. That's what strengthens local economies and not just health outcomes. Next, strengthen protections against predatory food marketing. You've already heard me wax on poetic about this already, but food marketing today does not just look like cartoon mascots on cereal boxes, and it is being misinterpreted as just Mr. Beast. It looks like fear-based labeling, influencer marketing, and packages covered in claims like natural, clean, no artificial ingredients, even when those labels don't tell parents meaningfully anything about the nutrition quality of a product. It's actually doing a disservice to parents because there's not enough nutrition knowledge there to understand what specific claims actually mean. And for example, clean and natural, those two terms are undefined. Those two terms don't even have a name. You can just use them as marketing terms. You can say whatever you want. Helping families navigate the food environment more clearly means strengthening FDA and FTC oversight of misleading claims and limiting digital advertising targeted at children. So we have to really think about doing both, because protecting kids also means protecting parents from confusing signals. Next, I would say let's incentivize reformulation instead of bans, instead of ingredient bans. You heard Calley mention nanny state, and I do think that it is surprising to hear a lot of folks, and it's certainly surprising for people on the left to hear a lot of folks on the right say that they're in favor of certain ingredient bans when it does feel like nanny state policy that was initially introduced by Michelle Obama. And that a lot of these, like a lot of discussions around bans or a lot of discussions around what school food should look like was really pushed back upon by Republicans when the Obamas were in the White House. Now, I actually think we're being presented with these things as if they're a binary choice, right? Like you either have nanny state policies and ingredient bans or you don't. I have to reject both of those options. I think we should be incentivizing reformulation instead of focusing on the bans. Most diet-related chronic disease in the US is driven by excess added sugar consumption, sodium, and saturated fat across dietary patterns. Not one single ingredient, not the food additive that's present in such a small amount that changes the color of the food, but actually the whole picture of what's in that food, the refined carbs, the added sugar, the lack of fiber, the lack of antioxidants, the lack of protein, right? There's so many things that are in that food that play a bigger, stronger role in why eating more of those foods over time is linked to increased risk of chronic disease. Okay. So if we were to set long-term nutrition targets and create incentives for companies to improve formulations that would raise nutritional quality across the food supply without removing choice or restricting access, I think bipartisan support right there. It's a compromise. It is not a ban. It's not nanny state, but it's also saying that we want to do this. We want to do this in the private sector. We want companies to improve the quality of their foods. Calley mentioned that he's having discussions with people in business, but I need more information on that. How? What are we talking about? What are we being incentivized to do rather than eliminating artificial colors on the Fruit Loops or, using the beetroot instead on the Fruit Loops? Why aren't we encouraging these companies to reduce the amount of added sugar in their products in the first place? And perhaps can we incentivize a process where they're able to use 100% whole grains in their products instead of refined grains, right? These are the more meaningful questions that are just not being asked and often get replaced with like these placeholder one-liners about food additives. I think we need to look at the whole picture of what these corporations are producing, what we would like to see more of in the marketplace. And I do think that this is where hopefully the dietary guidelines can have an impact, right? Choose 100% whole grains. Maybe this can help shift and start moving the needle for let's say General Mills and Kellogg's to start creating products that are more 100% whole grain based. That's where I think we have potential to start seeing some change. But saying that you're having conversations, I feel like is left a little bit vague, and I do want some follow up on that. But I think it's a little bit more than that. I do think there needs to be incentives here. I think corporations need to be incentivized to make these changes, but they need to be incentivized to make the right changes. Okay, my last one. And this is one that Calley alluded to, so I'm hoping that it is happening. I'm praying that it's happening. Expand access to nutrition counseling. Right now, most Americans can't afford to see an RD, a registered dietitian, even though nutrition is one of the most powerful tools we have for preventing chronic disease. Expanding insurance coverage for preventative nutrition counseling would reduce long-term healthcare costs and help families make changes that actually stick. Again, I've said this a million times this episode, but dietitians are one of the most underused prevention resources in the entire health system and in the entire country. Tap us in, read us in. There are so many ways that we could be used from a prevention standpoint rather than from a treatment standpoint, because right now the only way that you get guaranteed coverage for an RD visit, for counseling with a dietitian, is if you already have a comorbidity, if you already have a chronic disease, if you're already at risk, right? We want to prevent that from happening. So this is something that we should start incentivizing by making it easier to access and making it more widely available and publicizing that. All right. So those are the areas where I think there's real opportunity right now, not just to talk about making America healthier, but to actually build systems that make healthier choices easier for families over time. With all of that being said, I would absolutely love to hear what you think of all of this. What did you think of my interview with Calley Means? What did you think of this analysis? What do you think about my bipartisan MAHA ideas and more? If you listened to this episode, to this interview, and you work in nutrition, agriculture, health policy, food production, education, or if you're just trying to make sense of how all of this is affecting you and what shows up in your kitchen every day, I want to know what stood out to you and I want to hear from you. So you can always find me on social at Jaclyn London RD. My DMs are widely open. I did have a glitch there for a while where they were not open. So if you've heard me say that before and I haven't responded to you, it's probably because I didn't see it. Jaclyn London RD. And my DMs are open. I read everything when I can, when I see it. It's just a question of whether or not it actually gets to me, but I'm going to keep an eye out. They help shape what I cover in future episodes, and I'm hoping to be much more active on here now that I am officially out of the I'm still in the postpartum window, but officially out of this pregnancy and chaos. And when I can get a chance to actually record in a place where there aren't screaming children and dogs, I am going to continue to do that. If you found this episode helpful, thoughtful, clarifying in any way, the best way to support the show is by leaving a 5-star rating and a review wherever you're listening to this right now. I just want to say one more time, a huge thank you to AFPI for making this day happen, for making an incredible soup to nuts, highly detailed, really informative, really rich experience happen at the USDA, and the attention to detail and the facilitation of making everything simple and straightforward and easy to actually sit and learn and hear from real policymakers. That was really important. And it was so invaluable. I can't thank you enough to the folks at AFPI. Also, a huge thank you to Calley Means for the time and for the thoughtfulness and for actually taking 12 minutes to speak with me when I know that he certainly is very busy at this time. Thank you also to the folks at the USDA, of course, for everything that they made happen. An unbelievably well-oiled machine happening there. And of course, to Secretary Rollins for making National Ag Day such a special experience. And of course, thanks to all of you for listening. It's been wonderful hanging out with you. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I cannot wait to hear what you think. So for now, I will see you next time on The Business of Wellness.